So welcome again to Grinnell. I'm John Grinnell. I'm one of the co-chairs of the Poweshiek County Democrats. So many of you I have not seen since November 2018 because we've been snowed in, we've dealt with all this weather, but so many of you were a huge part of a great election. In this county, we had great numbers for the Democrats, and most importantly, we elected a new representative to Congress, Abby Finkenauer. So I want to thank you all so much, those of you who gave time, who knocked on doors, who voted. Thank you so much for all the success of 2018. And it's already time to start thinking about 2020 because we are in Iowa. So we are going to be the first in the nation to vote in this next upcoming presidential primary and caucus. So that's why we are trying to reach out to candidates early in the process. And so I'm very, very grateful that Mayor Pete Buttigieg is here today. So he was here the first time in 2017. The campus Democrats invited him, and he came out here to speak to Democrats. And so he wasn't a candidate then, but we had a feeling maybe he would be, so we reached out to his campaign, and they were really gracious in coming, so I wanted to just do a quick introduction. Pete is the mayor of South Bend, Indiana, so it's a city, it's like a city I think Democrats need to win in 2020. It's a city in the Midwest with industrial change, a diverse city, and so one that I think Democrats are really looking to do well in. And so Pete has been a very successful mayor, and so we're sort of eager to hear what he has to say. So actually, without further ado, I'm just going to go ahead and introduce him. So Mayor Pete Buttigieg is here. We're really grateful for your coming.
Thanks a lot.
Yeah.
Thanks for the invitation. Thank you. Well, thanks a lot for coming out on a cold day. Really appreciate being able to spend some time with you. And thanks to those I saw earlier when I visited the area, too. I think what I'll do is I'll just tell you a little bit about where I'm coming from, kind of literally, and then you'll understand where I'm coming from politically. And I'll try to be relatively short on monologue so we can have more of a conversation about whatever you think is most important for me to understand or whatever you'd like to talk about. So I'm from South Bend, Indiana, as was said. I don't know if any of you have had a chance to see it, but South Bend is exactly the kind of community that I think, in my view, like the communities here in Iowa and in this part of the Midwest, carry the center of gravity of what's about to happen in American politics. We were a city that revolved around the auto industry until the 60s, and then the auto industry collapsed. And we were written off as a dying community in the national press. The week I got into the race for mayor in South Bend in 2011 was when we were having a debate over a national article that said we were just that. We were one of America's 10 dying cities. And I came together with a lot of people who didn't believe that, because I had grown up, like many of us do in the industrial Midwest, maybe believing that message a little bit, that success meant getting out. Success meant going away. It meant finding the biggest city. It meant finding the coasts and turning your back on where you came from. But the further I went from home, the more I realized that it meant something to be from somewhere. The more I realized that Midwest nice really is a thing. And people looked at me funny when I struck up conversations the way I thought you just did on a normal basis, because I was from Indiana and that's how we treated each other. And I began to realize I had something to offer my community. I had had a career in business. I'd had military training, and I saw that our community was looking for a different way forward. And I ran for office at the age of 29, became for a while the youngest mayor in America of a city with 100,000 people or more. And to make a very long story short, at the end of this decade, our city believes in itself again. We are growing at a pace that we haven't seen in years. We addressed over 1,000 vacant and abandoned properties in less than 1,000 days. We changed the trajectory of our city. And the reason I share that story is I think we have to change the trajectory of our country. I think communities like ours are a powerful response to the message that is being peddled by the people in the White House right now, which is that the only answer for the Midwest is nostalgia and resentment. I think they're telling Americans to look for greatness in all the wrong places. I don't believe you can find greatness in the past. I don't believe that any honest politics can revolve around the word again, or for that matter, the word back. And I think that's especially true at this historical juncture we're at now. I think that the future is not going to look like the past, and that doesn't have to be a bad thing. I don't believe that we can rewind to the 90s as Democrats any more than we ought to rewind to the 50s, as a lot of conservatives seem to want for us to do. I believe there's only one way, and it's forward. And I also think there is a moment for a new generation to offer leaders too. You know, I think a lot about the way the world's going to look in the year 2054. That's the year when I will reach the current age of the current president. And I think if you're worried about what the world will look like, worried about what your life will look like then, you have a different perspective. I think that this generation that is beginning to arrive in politics has arrived in the U.S. Congress in a really compelling and exciting way in this last cycle. By the way, I'm so glad that Abby got elected. We supported her too, and thank you for what you did to send leaders like her to the U.S. Congress, because I think that represents leadership from the generation that experienced school shootings while we were students and has grown up with that as the norm. And by the way, the generation that furnished most of the troops for the conflicts after 9/11, and the generation that's going to be paying the bills for the tax cuts for billionaires that have been recklessly passed in Washington, and the generation that's on the business end of climate change right now. I know Iowa has seen tons of extreme weather in recent years. It's been a problem for us too. So I don't want us anymore to allow climate change to arouse images of ice sheets calving off the Antarctic, because climate change is happening right here in the Midwest. It happened in our community in the form of a 500-year flood that came 18 months after a 1,000-year rainfall, which means either the math is just ridiculous in terms of my luck of what's happening on my watch as mayor, or things are really changing exactly the way we were warned that they would. And the question is, what are we going to do about it? I think that the Democratic Party offers the best answers on what 21st century security looks like, because we realize that 21st century security includes things like climate security, not to mention things like cybersecurity and election security that the other side doesn't want to talk about. In some cases, doesn't even want to admit is a real problem. And I also think, by the way, that our party ought to be the one talking about freedom, which has been monopolized in our political language by people on the other side of the aisle, because they are fixated on freedom from government. And freedom from overbearing government is an important American value, which is one of the reasons I think we're rightly skeptical of what we're seeing in countries from Saudi Arabia to Russia. But there's more to freedom than freedom from government. There's a lot of weights to be put around the idea of freedom to, not just freedom from. Like freedom to live a life of your choosing, which is not available to you if you don't know where you're going to get health care. Or freedom to marry the person that you love. Not subject to what a county clerk has to say, but subject to what your heart says. By the way, let me introduce my husband, Chaston. He's one in the green sweater there. And that brings me to the other thing that I think mayors understand, I think anyone in our generation understands. I think anybody really regards politics as the art of the everyday understands, which is politics doesn't matter because of the game, the show that's going on in Washington. Politics matters because our lives go differently based on the decisions the politicians make. My marriage, the most important thing in my life, exists by the grace of a single vote on the U.S. Supreme Court. And so many things in our lives, our finances, our health, our environment, depend in a very intimate, very immediate, very real way on the choices that are being made. And we need to return our politics to that. Part of the idea of a mayor, and I get what it looks like for a mayor of a Midwestern community to be talking about the 2020 conversation. But part of what I think a mayor uniquely can bring to this conversation is that ground level reality and the reality-based politics that you experience every day when you're operating at the city level. I don't get to create alternative facts in local government because people can go check whether or not what I said was true. If I say there's no hole in the road and there's a hole in the road, guess what? There's a hole in the road. And I will be accountable for filling it. And we've somehow gotten away from this in the White House and in national politics more generally. And if we can make Washington look more like our best run cities and towns instead of the other way around, I think we're going to be making real progress. So those are some of the reasons that I'm in this conversation. But again, I think this will probably be a better conversation here this afternoon if we talk about what's interesting to you. So I'd love to hear your observations, your questions, your ideas, and talk about it until they get the hook and tell us where to go next. Yeah, Chairman.
To ask the first question, and one is that a huge part that will be different about your job as president and as mayor is you're dealing with issues about trade. And I know in Iowa, trade is a really big issue right now, with decisions about soybean tariffs, with decisions about corn tariffs. I'd be interested to sort of see like what you've been able to figure out both from being in Indiana and sort of also having farming communities near you, and as you've done your own thinking, where you are on some of these issues going into 2020.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, my perspective on trade war is a lot like my perspective on regular war. Don't get into one if you don't have to. And you know, growers, especially when it comes to soy and corn. And by the way, even though there are some beneficiaries of tariffs in the steel industry, also both where I come from and around here, of course, there are a lot of companies that do more purchasing metal than they do making it, and they're hurting right now with some of these tariffs and threats of trade war that are going on. Look, I think most of us in this part of the country recognize that the promises that were made around trade in the 90s were not kept. The promise was, you know, let us do this, and we're going to grow the whole pie by so much that even if your particular industry or particular sector, or particular community is made worse off, there's going to be more than enough to compensate you for that. And that promise was broken. The pie grew. That part happened, right? The top line numbers of the U.S. economy went up, but a lot of it never got to us. And that's why a lot of people where I come from are pissed. It's one of the reasons why my traditionally Democratic county voted basically 50-50 in the 2016 race. That doesn't mean we shut ourselves off. It doesn't mean we pretend we can build a wall around the status quo. Because a lot of the changes happening to our economy are the consequence of technology anyway, not trade. It does mean that we insist on fair trade that actually takes care of people who are impacted by it. But, you know, in my community right now, one of the biggest sources of union auto jobs is a company backed by foreign direct investment from China. And by the way, they're in the green economy. They're making electric vehicles. So it doesn't have to be a question of either isolating ourselves from the rest of the world or giving in to deals that are only going to benefit those at the top. But I think that the way it's been handled up to now is a good example of why our party can't promise that we're going to restore the old order, and shouldn't, any more than conservatives are trying to do on their side. Yeah.
So I want to get your thoughts on what Democrats should do about the filibuster. Should they retain, or should they regain power in that chamber? Just because we've seen in the Obama years just how much Republicans have used that Senate procedure to block a lot of Obama's initiatives, even if, you know, he tried to offer concessions to Republicans. And, you know, in best case scenario, if Democrats win the Senate by, like, you know, 52, 53, 54 seats, there's no way they're going to get up to 60. So I just want to give you an opportunity to, you know, share your thoughts on what.
Yeah, so I don't have a considered kind of final opinion on what the Senate caucus ought to do, and it does depend, I think, partly on the dynamics of what happens in the race. I do think it has to be on the table, because we've been burned enough times where we have the sense of fair play, right? And they don't. And the challenge, the moral challenge, of course, is we don't want to become what we're fighting. We don't want to emulate the others. But to the extent that the others have been, frankly, more capable students of the question of power than we have, then I think we've got to be ready to fight back and fight fire with fire. Yes?
You said that you support Medicare for all.
Yes.
So I was wondering if you could give us a little more specifics on what exactly that means
Yeah.
and how you plan to pay for it.
Yeah, I will to an extent. Let me preface this by saying something. I'm a policy guy. I'm a geek. I'm also trying to be very disciplined about taking time to bake good policy proposals, because I watched what happened when our party, I think, was actually more intentional about policy details than we were about basic values. And I want our conversation this time around, in a way that actually the right often does, is to connect kind of first principles and ideas up first, and then begin talking about how that will cash out in terms of policy. And so that's one reason you're going to see us take maybe a little bit more time than some of the others in offering up policy frameworks that have detail in them. That being said, let me tell you in broad strokes what I see. Citizens of most developed countries in the world enjoy universal health care. This is one of those things that most people get as part of being in a developed country, and American citizens are left out of that. We took a big leap forward with the ACA. That made a lot of Americans' lives better, including our family. My mother-in-law relies on insurance that she buys through the ACA to get chemotherapy that is saving her life. But there are lots of people who are uninsured or underinsured, and the underinsurance part in particular is a problem. we also need to do a lot more to contain healthcare costs. So I think it's very clear that Medicare for all, or something resembling it, is the right destination. By the way, I want to point out, because this is being caricatured as this wacky left-wing idea, Medicare for all is single payer is a compromise. The far-right position is Wild West, all corporate, you're on your own. The left-wing position is national health care, where the doctors work for the government. And by the way, that's not just a Soviet solution, that's how it works in England. And it's not bad for the English. I'm not sure it's right for the Americans. But anyway, the compromise position is single payer. Private doctors, public insurance. So let's stop allowing this to be caricatured as some far left concept that America couldn't possibly get our heads around. I do think there's a question of the transition dynamics and the pathway there. That's why I'm really interested in the idea of kind of Medicare for all who want it as a way we get there. So essentially it's taking something resembling Medicare and making it available as a public option on the exchange. And then if people like me are right that that's going to be a good way to go, then more and more people will be buying into it anyway. How you pay for it? Well, the taxation structure in this country is obviously not sustainable. And there were a lot of people who are not paying their fair share. By the way, again, this is not some wild, red socialist idea. This is something most Americans get. People aren't paying their fair share. We are. I think most of us in middle-class tax brackets would say that we are. But it remains the case that someone like Warren Buffett often pays less than his secretary. It remains the case that we are more prepared to tax work than we are to tax wealth. So I think a wealth tax is absolutely something that needs to be part of the portfolio. We can quibble over what percent at what level, but bottom line is, if you've benefited that much from being an American, you can share a little bit of your annual return with us, with the rest of the people who built the roads and the rule of law and the healthcare structure and everything else that's made it possible for you to become, in some cases, preposterously wealthy. Often, by the way, using the internet, which was literally invented by the federal government. So maybe we should think twice before defunding R&D, right? I know that's broad, but my point is the taxation structure inevitably will need to include a fair, which is to say higher for some, rate of taxation at the income level on marginal tax rates on top of it.
Would it be as high as 70%?
It could. I mean, again,
Who would support that?
what's that? So this is where I'm talking about taking a healthy beat to structure things that will mathematically cash out. Because I want to look more at how we balance that with what we contributed on the wealth tax side. And also tweaking the estate tax. So one of the big arguments against taxes is that they can distort your choices. But for them to distort your choices, you have to be alive. And if you have, I'm not talking about family farms, I'm talking about huge sums of wealth. When those are transferred, there's no distortionary negative side to that if you have, if we're talking about an estate. So I think that deserves a bigger proportional part of our taxation system than it currently gets. We might even want to talk about a financial transactions tax, right? Many people who become stupendously wealthy do so on the basis of taking a little cut out of these elaborate, complex transactions whose real value to the real economy remains unproven. We should be open to a tax structure that looks at those. So I'm not ready here in February 2019 to lay out the full kind of enumerated tax proposal that we're working toward. But I will say in principle, those are some of the things I think we need to do. And if we did them right, then I think we would be able to pay for, again, something that most developed country citizens enjoy, like universal health care, good infrastructure, adequate public education, and the other things that we should expect as Americans to have. Thanks. Yes?
So kind of like going away from taxes and kind of doing the opposite, which is the idea of a universal basic income, which is something that Andrew Yang, the current contenders, talked about a little bit. And I think it is a little bit of a far-fetched idea, and I'm not sure, I'm not really asking for your view on that, but I'm curious about your opinion on maybe like the root causes, which is that it seems like money, intellectual capital also is being lost in post-industrial areas and is going to areas like Silicon Valley, just creating massive amounts of wealth. And so what do you see as ways to remedy that and ways to like reinvest, especially now that automation, artificial intelligence are just going to accelerate that process even more into the next couple decades?
Right. Some of my team will roll their eyes a little bit and be getting super wonky, but I can tell this is a group that's ready for it. So I'm actually chairing a task force of the U.S. mayors on the subject of automation because we're wrestling with this and we're asking what does this mean for our economies and our communities? I think we're underestimating how profound the change will be. But it's also the case that it's not as simple as these jobs stay and these jobs go away forever. It's that most jobs change. The job of a doctor will change. The job of a clerk at a fast food store will change. But both of those jobs in some form will exist. Matter of fact, last time I heard out of the NAICS codes that the Bureau of Labor Statistics maintains, the only classification for a job that literally completely went away in recent years because of automation, I'll wait a beat in case anybody wants to try to guess it, is elevator operator. But most jobs just change. Look at an ATM. The ATM was invented. Employment actually in retail banking environments went up. But the kind of physical, repeatable task of making change for people became less important. Human-facing and problem-solving and critical thinking skills became more important. So one part of the answer here is we've got to invest in education in a different way. Another thing we've got to do, as you say, is that it's feeding this kind of disequilibrium geographically, right? Communities like ours in the Midwest have seen an emptying effect. I think part of that is going to begin to reverse itself is now beginning to reverse itself because of just basic economics. The fact that when we do get these busloads of venture capitalists from Silicon Valley coming to check out the Rust Belt, which is happening more and more, I show them, for example, my big house on the river, and the fact that it costs less than a parking space in Palo Alto. And some of those things I think will tilt, but not all of that's going to happen on its own. It makes quality of place that much more important, right? So if people are mobile, if workers are mobile, then part of what's going to happen is they're even more going to be selective of just the kind of environment that's got everything from safety, schools, and good roads to, brew pubs and a good brunch scene, stuff that people just like to have. And that's some of the basic blocking and tackling work that good local government can do, but also that requires a measure of public investment. The last thing I would add is that I think that there's going to be a fundamental challenge of a sense of purpose that will really come due for our generation. In that it used to be the case that your job was not just how you made your money. It was how you explained who you were. It still is a lot of it. I mean, you're at a party, you meet somebody, first thing they say is, what do you do, right? That did a lot more work for us when people could count on a lifelong relationship with a single employer. I mean, it could be true if you were an auto worker and you knew for 30 years you were going to be at this factory and you were part of the same union and your spouses got to know each other because you're in the bowling league together. Or in a white-collar environment, a law firm or a CPA, which is pretty much the same thing in terms of the social culture, just playing out in different venues. That's not going to happen. We're going to change careers more often than our parents changed jobs. And the dislocation that goes with that, I think, is incredibly dangerous. I think it contributes to deaths from despair. I think it contributes to the opioid problems we're having and a lot of other psychological problems that are affecting America. And so I think even when you can solve the income question for somebody who's been disrupted, which is part of what UBI is about, right? It still doesn't solve the identity question. I think there are a lot of ways to furnish different sources of that sense of community identity and purpose that you used to get from your career. Some of that comes from community itself. There are people in our city, I don't even know what they do for a living, but I know who they are and how they fit because they're a contribution to the life of the city. It could be even a very beautiful thing. It could be expressed in the arts. Some conservative sounding things like faith and family that I think are a very important part of how we fill that void. If we don't, other things will fill that void, like white identity politics and some of the other things being offered by the current administration. And that takes us to a very ugly place. So we don't have all the answers, but those are some of the directions I think we need to move in, and I'm glad you're alive to that question because I think it's really important, especially for our region. Yeah.
So I was wondering sort of specifically about your stance on nuclear power, and then sort of zooming out, your sort of ideas for how the United States may need to expand its sustainable energy infrastructure in order to kind of move away from fossil fuels.
Yeah, so first of all, I'm glad we're finally having a little conversation about this at the level of ambition that's required. The importance to me of the Green New Deal is twofold. First of all, it is based on the concept that we're in a state of emergency, and I think we are. I mean, if we're being asked to believe that a migrant caravan represents a national emergency, you better believe that profound changes to our climate and the consequent changes on our weather and before somebody on Twitter lets me know that climate is not weather, I know but they're related, and one has something to do with the other, right? And that's true whether you're seeing the river flooding that is happening in central Iowa, or whether we're talking about California literally being on fire. That's an emergency. And so, to me, the priority has to be carbon. Now, the challenge with nuclear is actually looks good from a carbon perspective. And so while I don't know that it meets the definition of sustainable, and that was the word you used, and therefore, sooner or later, we got to migrate away from it. I don't think the priority is getting away from that. I think the priority is getting away from anything that entails carbon. Because I don't see how else we get to 2030, or for that matter, even 2050, without it. The good news is renewable energy can be a great source of jobs. Now, I know there's this political temptation to say, not only is it the right thing to do, but it's also good for business. Well, yes, but even if there's a cost, we still have to pay the cost. So it may not cost the same. It may be more expensive than coal, and we should do it anyway. It's the whole premise of a renewable energy standard, and it's good policy. It's why we actually have policy interventions in the marketplace. And so I think we need to invest in that. But the good news is it does create a lot of jobs. I saw out my window the other day a train rolling through South Bend with the giant blades of the wind farms, and we were driving past them right this afternoon on our way here. I don't know if they're the same blades, but it's the same economy. And so I think there's a lot of promise. What I would love to see also, from an empowerment perspective, is that we not only talk about making the U.S. energy independent, which is also not the same as renewable, but we're more based on renewables, but also I'd like individual homes, in many cases, to become energy independent. We're not that far with the cost of solar PV from being able to do that. We've got habitat houses going up right now in South Bend where it looks like a sticker. On the roof is these long black stickers. It doesn't quite pencil out that it's the cheapest source of energy, but if we actually invested like it was a national priority, I'm talking like $5 billion a year, it probably will be. And so there's a lot of good news to be had in making individuals, especially low-income people, energy independent at the personal family home level, not to mention what that means for the U.S.
Yeah. So I think that part of the problem with us, this like horrible government shutdown and everything, is that the president is unable to work with the other party, right? If you become president, the chances are that one of the chambers will be controlled by the Republicans, right? So I'm wondering, what issues are you willing to give up on, right? To sort of sacrifice in order to get other issues through for the Republicans?
Yeah, so my experience in South Bend, I would not be able to do my job if I didn't find ways to work well with conservatives and Republicans. I'm on my third Republican governor in Indiana. I've worked well with Republican council members in our city. And it was never about pretending to be more conservative than I am. It was about keeping the focus on results. And it was about finding areas of common cause. So I don't know, I'm trying your question on for size, but I don't know that I can get on board with the sort of things you give up. I mean, yes, there's a give and take, but
compromise.
Maybe it's more accurate to my way of thinking to look at it as a question of what do you prioritize. So there are some things that everybody ought to be able to get on board with, at least if you can keep the politics out of it. Infrastructure is a good example. In fact, this president promised, it sounded like it was the one bipartisan thing he was going to do, and it just didn't happen. But it could have, and it has to. And I'm talking about not just the kind of infrastructure we usually picture, but also, as a mayor, I'm thinking about incredibly unsexy infrastructure like wastewater and water. But if we want to stay ahead of things like lead poisoning, we got to do that too, right? But the other interesting thing to me is issues that have a strong partisan profile in the Twitter sphere, but actually most Americans are on board with. Background checks is a good example. They won't totally solve gun violence, but they can't hurt. 90% of Americans are for. And if 90% of Americans are for something and we still can't have it, that tells you that our democracy is busted. And there are all kinds of reasons why. We know what they are, money in politics, the way the districts are drawn. But we could do something to change some of that. And if the center of gravity of the American Congress looked a little more like the center of gravity of the American people, I think there would be more rewards for compromising, because chances are we'll be more likely to get to the overlapping consensus of the American people themselves, which is not what you're seeing right now in the forces that act on members of Congress. That'll take a lot of work to do. It might require constitutional amendments to actually do that, if you really want to get at money in politics, or even some of what we have to do to secure voting rights. Not to mention doing away with the Electoral College, which, in my view, having seen the American people overruled twice in my short lifetime, I think it's something we have to consider. But I don't think something's impossible just because it requires constitutional action. I mean, our country changed its constitution in order to make it illegal to drink. And then we realized that was a dumb idea and we changed it back, right? So of course we can look at those solutions in order to improve our democracy. And I think we have to, for compromise to be something that gets rewarded rather than punished in our political system. Yeah.
First off, I'd like to thank you for your service in the war in Afghanistan.
Thank you.
And also, pardon me, I'm going to have my sister record your answer if that's okay.
Okay.
So, let me cough. So, I watched The View interview before we came in, and Meghan McCain asked you a question about your belief in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And I was wondering about how you felt about what the capital of Israel should be, and also taking a wider look at how you intend to fix the problems that our president has had in the UN.
Yeah, and so for those who didn't see it, I was responding to a question about somebody who compared Israel to Iran, and I think the conditions within those two regimes are very different. I also believe that things are going to have to change for Israel to be on a sustainable path. And if it were left to me, the decision to move the embassy to Jerusalem should have been part of some kind of negotiation and give and take. Ordinary Israelis will tell you, hey, we don't need anybody to tell us who our capital is. But the Israeli government really cared about that. And the Israeli government could have been doing more on things like settlements that are an obstacle to peace. And if America wants to continue to be regarded as an honest broker, and again, some of this is a generational concern too, because we're going to be alive when there is no way around this question, this demographic question of how you can have a Jewish state that's also a democracy. If we want to help our ally deal with this, not to mention meet some moral responsibility to improve the well-being of the Palestinian people, then we have a responsibility as an honest broker to try to guide them toward doing things we think are more in the regional interest and the American interest. And one of those would have been attaching some kind of conditions to that move, in my view. Yeah.
So a lot of us are college students here, and for the past couple of years, Grinnell College has been raising tuition 3 or 4%. So I know you don't want to, go into specifics of policy at this point in your campaign, but how progressive are you willing to go on the scale of universal pre-K, free community college, and free public universities?
So I think universal pre-K is easy, morally, because it pays for itself. At least that's what most of the research will tell us. And if we make that investment early, there's every indication that it will pay off down the line. Not just in terms of things you can measure within the educational system, but things like public health and public safety. Crime can be improved through interventions at the very earliest stages of life. When it comes to college affordability, we've obviously got to do more. It doesn't mean that college has to be completely free. And I'll tell you that the reason, as a progressive, the reason there's a bit of a concern about that is that it remains the case that many people won't be going to college. And it is regressive for people who aren't going to college to pay for those who will, if by going to college we're increasing our earning power and able to earn more in the future. But that doesn't mean that the current cost of college is acceptable. We have to buy that down. I think it's worth national investment to buy that down. Again, this is something most citizens of many developed countries already enjoy. And it's also the case that we have some structures now that we could use to build on that, like the Public Service Loan Forgiveness Program, which encourages people who choose careers in public service or in teaching to do so, partly by helping to wipe out their debt. That program has become less accessible under the current administration at the exact moment when we should be growing it and increasing it. So I think there's economic benefit at the highest level to doing something about college costs. By the way, let's also talk about being able to refinance a student loan the way you can refinance a home loan, right? Seems reasonable. I think we can do all of those things, and I think when we do, we will find that the investment pays off in terms of the American future, too. Yeah.
So, looking ahead to an extremely crowded 2020 campaign, do you see the overcrowding of the field splitting the vote? And to that end, will you support the eventual Democratic nominee?
So I definitely plan to support the Democratic nominee. Obviously, I have a certain view about who that ought to be, but I also think it's really important that we come together, and I think we will. I think if there's a silver lining on the current horror show in Washington, it's that it's supplied a little more of a unity of purpose among Democrats. I actually think more people in the race is a good thing. I believe that, especially at this moment that we're figuring out what being a Democrat ought to mean, I think that means that we should be weighing these big picture questions in a way that requires people to plant flags on various parts of the field so we can all decide what that actually looks like, and challenging the people who get in front of rooms like this with our ideas to see how well they stand up under pressure. I think the more the merrier. And a bit selfishly, I tend to think a really wide open field with a lot of people in it probably benefits newcomers and underdogs, if you're good. And it's for you, not me, to decide whether that's a dynamic that benefits somebody like me. Yes, in the back.
I brought my grandson with me today. He's going to be able to vote in his first election next year.
Fantastic.
And it strikes me in seeing you and listening to you in the first weeks of your campaign that you're resonating with the kind of audience you have here, which I think is understandable and great. How do you also notice that the Republicans now, including the president, have started to label a lot of these progressive ideas as socialism,
right,
which really carries a kind of this generational set of baggage.
Yeah.
People like myself. So,
right.
You know, we've got the demographic right here. How do you address that? How do you deal with the labeling that is starting to happen?
Yeah, it's a great question. I've been thinking about this a lot because I think the socialism thing is one example of something that just cuts very differently for different generations, right? If you came of age in the Cold War and socialism meant communism and communism meant totalitarianism, then it was a pretty easy kill switch on an idea just to label it socialist, and then people wouldn't want to get too close to it. And I think there's a newer generation that didn't experience that same kind of visceral reaction, that has also noticed that capitalism and democracy have been in a certain kind of tension. Whereas it used to be, it was capitalism and democracy on one team and socialism and communism on the other. And they're asking of any individual policy idea, whether it's a Green New Deal or whether it's universal health care or something else, not is it socialist, but is it good? And I think that's a healthy place to be. Because we can argue about whether it's good, and maybe somebody can prove that it's not, but that's a much healthier argument than having the argument itself shut down preemptively by name calling. My hope is that we can talk about politics more and more in terms of everyday life. And my fear about the horror show in Washington is it sucks all of our attention onto what's happening there, and it moves it away from daily life. But I'm thinking all the time, and again, partly it's the perspective of somebody who, whose marriage depends on a political choice that was made, and somebody who was sent to war on the orders of a president. But also whose community has really been rising or falling on the basis of political decisions. If we can have this conversation be at that, then I actually think that tends to redound to the benefit of progressives. And a great example I would give of that is the debate over health care. When it was about something in the abstract, something that was labeled as socialism, despite, as I argued earlier, being kind of more conservative than not in some ways. The ACA was almost a fatal liability for our party in 2010. Those town halls, they're talking about death panels and, all this crazy stuff when they were talking about it in the abstract. By 2018, there were another set of town halls, and those town halls demonstrated that healthcare was actually a winning issue, possibly the winning issue for Democrats. And I think that was true because by then it had actually happened. And so the conversations in those town halls weren't about what crazy thing might be conceivable. It was people whose lives had been changed by this law, getting in the faces of members of Congress and saying, this changed my life, and you're going to change it in a negative way. And I think it's harder to lie to people about what's happening in their own life than it is in the abstract. Just as we're a little more decent toward people we know in our own lives than we are in the abstract. And it struck me how people who have some of the most ferocious and exclusionary views on immigration in general have very tender views towards specific people they know who could be impacted by immigration policy, to take another example. I think part of what turned the tide on LGBTQ equality was the difference between talking about an abstract group and then beginning to realize this category, this group, was actually people that we actually knew and cared about. So the more we can concretize that political debate and get it away from the realm of labels, the better. It's not easy. It's certainly not something that the media environment favors. But to me, that's the virtue of the fact that the Road to 2020 goes through rooms like this, where we can have very concrete conversations about what these policies mean, who they help and who they hurt. And hopefully, when you subject them to that test, our policies are more convincing. Yes?
Looking at global issues such as sex trafficking, climate refugees, or the drug trade, how does your experience as a local politician influence your positions on how to act in those situations?
Yeah. Well, partly because I think every global issue touches down locally for someone, right? Again, climate's a great example. To me, climate change isn't what's happening in the Arctic Circle, it's what's happening in South Bend. And I think we can tie that back to somebody's lived reality all the time. The other thing is to question what America's role in the world ought to be. And I felt America's role in the world in the assumptions that were made about me when I was abroad, whether it was as a student studying Arabic in Tunisia or in the UK, or whether it was in uniform and the way people responded to the American flag that was stuck to my shoulder. And if we lose the sense that that American flag represents a country that, however imperfectly, can generally be relied on to keep its word and stand up for universal values like democracy and human rights, if we lose that, then I think all the other stuff starts to crumble. I think we stop being a country that other people wish they were a part of. That may have already begun to happen. And if we allow that to continue to happen, all the weaponry in the world isn't going to keep us safe. So now's the moment where that's going to be tested. And it's as much a moral as a tactical question. But that's one of the reasons this election matters so much. I'm getting the high sign, so I guess we're about wrapped. Okay, one more then? Here on the outside.
On climate change.
Yeah.
As a mayor, what kind of a plan have you put in place to combat carbon emissions for the city of South Bend? For instance, increasing the insulation of buildings or?
Yeah, so the moment the president withdrew from Paris, and actually before that, we had begun to realize as the community of American mayors that, you know, if we just act, it doesn't matter what our national government does, we have a healthy enough chunk of the economy and the population of the U.S. that if we all stick to our plan or commit to meeting those goals, we can get somewhere. Some of the things we've done in South Bend include just what you're talking about, building upgrades, upgrading things like lighting in city-owned facilities. We've been doing vehicle upgrades. We had CNG as kind of a step, hopefully eventually to electric vehicles for our police department fleet. We also introduced electric vehicle charging ports funded by the city. There's one right across the street from the county city building, so you can plug your vehicle in there, and it's part of a way that we can encourage more people to adopt it. We're in the process right now of building toward a greenhouse gas inventory because we don't yet fully know what the carbon footprint of our community is, but once we know what it is, we can start to identify the lowest hanging fruit for next steps. I really believe local action, coordinated globally, can be just as powerful as things that are done in the international arena, especially if that local action is consistent, though you would hope that it would be helped and reinforced, not undermined and injured by the choices that are made in Washington. Sounds, can we squeeze in one more? Yeah, okay.
I just wanted to point out to you that there were some good things that happened during the 50s. One of them was I got to vote for the first time.
Yeah.
But we also had a high income tax bracket.
Right.
And we had good labor unions.
Yes.
And you have not addressed labor unions.
I'm glad you brought that up. Yes. No, you know, I got into politics because there was a fight over whether it was the right thing for the Obama administration to do to rescue Chrysler and the auto industry. And to make a very long story short, I was running against an opponent who tried to block that entire deal because he was upset that the United Auto Workers got too good of a deal in that. Labor unions, as you point out, were a ladder into the middle class for so much of America's modern growth. And we see the attacks on labor that have, I think, contributed to the income inequality and the economic insecurity that Americans are experiencing today. And to the other point, which I also think is important, you know, each stage in American life up until now has been one where democracy was expanded. Each generation has been able to say, at the end, that America was a little more democratic than before. Whether you go way back to, you know, the expansion of the vote beyond property owners, or whether you go to suffrage, or whether you go to the Voting Rights Act, America became more democratic each passing decade until now. And now I think America has become less democratic. It is harder for people to exercise their legitimate right to vote. The Electoral College becomes more distorting each year because of the way that some states' population is so different than others. And if we really care about our democracy, I think we need to ask, what can we do so that my generation can say the same thing as the generations before us, that at the end of the day, our democratic republic was more democratic than it was when we got here. And that's one of the things I think is at stake right now in 2020. But thank you for raising those questions, because there are some things that we absolutely need to look to the very best in our American tradition, if only to give ourselves permission to do these things that make sense when you test them in the real world. Thank you again for being here. I hope that this isn't the last time I'll see you, and I look forward to visiting a little bit if time allows before we have to go. Thanks so much. What do you do?